Welcome to AP Biology. This video is on animal behavior. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. A behavior is defined as an animal's response to sensory input. It's an animal's response to a stimulus. A stimulus is any factor that causes a response in an organism. We're going to be looking at three different types of behaviors. The first type is called the learned behavior. Learned behaviors are a behavior that an organism learns over its lifetime. Innate behaviors are instinct. They're genetically pre-programmed. Finally, orientation behaviors are going to place an organism in its most favorable environment. We begin with learned behaviors. There are multiple types of learning that we're going to be learning about. The first type is associative learning. Associative learning is when a link or an association is made between a stimulus and a particular behavior. There are two different types of associative learning. The first type is called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was studied by a famous psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. And most of us have heard of Pavlov's experiment with his dogs. In classical conditioning, two stimuli are put together in terms of a response. With Pavlov's experiment, he rang a bell, he sprayed a meat spray inside of a dog's mouth, and that caused salivation. So two stimuli were put together, the ringing of the bell and the meat spray, and the response was salivation. Pavlov did this enough times. When he just rang the bell, it would immediately cause salivation to take place. This is what classical conditioning is called, or this is how classical conditioning works. And classical conditioning is typically used to train animals to do stuff. Two specific stimuli are put together in terms of a particular response. The second type of associative learning is called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is just trial and error learning, in which a behavior is modified by its consequences. Operant conditioning was studied by a famous psychologist named B.F. Skinner. In a moment, we're going to look at an example of classical conditioning, and we're going to look at an example of operant conditioning as well. With either type of associative learning, if a stimulus occurs too often, habituation will take place. If you keep doing a stimulus over and over and over again, eventually the organism gets used to it and you lose the response. You lose the behavior. Second type of learning is called observational learning or social learning, and that's learning from the actions of others. We typically see this with little kids that have big brothers and sisters. They learn by watching the actions of their brothers and sisters. Next, we have spatial learning. Spatial learning is memory that reflects the environment's spatial structure. In other words, you remember where things are. We see this a lot in animals like honeybees. We see this a lot in animals like squirrels. Squirrels remember where they hid their nuts by remembering or using the location of various things in the environment like trees and houses, and they use that to memorize where they hid their nuts. If you look at a bee looks at various things in its environment as well, various land structures, and they use that to guide their movements and to remember where things are located. Finally, the last type of learned behavior is insight or cognition, and insight is limited to really high order organisms like ourselves, chimps, gorillas, different types of apes. And with insight, you're really able to think about a problem and based upon past experience, come up with a solution. Very, very few animals have the ability to do that. We're going to look at a quick video, and this first video that we see is going to show an example of classical conditioning.
The neat things about hippos that might surprise you. They can hold their breath underwater for up to 6 minutes, and they can run much faster than humans. But you may also be surprised to learn that these huge animals can be trained. Unlike dogs and other pets, however, these animals aren't trained for tricks. They're trained so that we can take better care of them. This river hippopotamus is being trained to open her mouth using positive reinforcement. First, the keeper holds up an appealing food item, such as a carrot or piece of apple. Then when the hippo opens her mouth, her keeper presses a clicker and rewards her promptly with the food. The clicker, known as the bridge, helps the hippo associate the desired behavior, holding her mouth open, with a pleasurable outcome, the tasty food. Now that the hippo has been trained to open the mouth on cue, the keepers can check the condition of her teeth and look for injuries or foreign objects.
Alright, so here we see an example of classical conditioning being used to train this hippo. Two stimuli are put together, the clicking and the food source. And when the food source is raised over the hippo's head, the trainer clicks his clicker, and the hippo opens its mouth and it's given a reward. The reward is food. After doing this a number of times, just by clicking the clicker, the hippo will learn to just open its mouth. This is going to allow the trainers to look at things like the condition of the hippo's teeth. Next, we're going to see an example of operant conditioning, or trial and error learning. We're going to see something called the Skinner box. So through trial and error, this mouse learned that by pressing the lever, he's going to be rewarded with food. This also works in the reverse, right? If an animal touches something and say they get electrocuted, they're going to learn to not touch it. Both of these are examples of operant conditioning or trial and error learning. This next group of behaviors are called innate behaviors. Innate behaviors are inherited. They're genetically pre-programmed. And the most classic example of an innate behavior is instinct. Instinctual behaviors are genetically inherited behaviors. Here we see two examples of instinct, or two examples of innate behaviors. One is called a fixed action pattern, and two is called imprinting. A fixed action pattern is a behavior that is complete the first time the organism encounters the stimulus. So the organism doesn't learn to have this behavior. The first time that the organism sees a stimulus, this behavior is automatically performed. So it's a classic example of instinct. Fixed action patterns were studied by a psychologist named Nico Tinbergen, and we're going to look at his famous experiment using these stickleback fish that we see on the right here. Imprinting is another example of an innate behavior. It was studied by a famous psychologist named Konrad Lorenz, and during imprinting, organisms have a critical period or a sensitive period in their life in which a particular behavior is learned. We see this with ducks and geese that you see on the upper right hand corner right here. These organisms have a critical period in their life where they learn who their mother is. And whatever organism is with them at that critical period, they think that that organism is their mother. We'll see a little video with Konrad Lorenz, and he was with these ducks during their critical period, so they all think that he was their mother. So we see these videos and these pictures of all these little ducklings following this guy around. We're going to see a video showing both Nico Tinbergen's experiment and the imprinting performed by Konrad Lorenz. With the Nico Tinbergen experiment, We're going to be looking at stickleback fish within a fish tank. And these stickleback fish, the males are really territorial. And if they see other males, they have this pre-programmed fixed action pattern where they attack the males. The male stickleback fish has a red underbelly. And what happens is anytime the males encounter anything that's red, they charge it. It's pre-programmed. Nico Tinbergen realized this when he had these stickleback fish in a fish tank, and the fish tank was by a window, and every time that a red truck would drive by, these fish would ram themselves against the side of the tank. And he figured out that this fixed action pattern is pre-programmed. Anytime a red stimulus is encountered, the male stickleback fish will charge it. Let's check out his experiment. So here you have 3 different types of fish. Here you have one that looks like a male but with no red belly. Here you have other fish that don't look like fish at all, but they have the red belly. Here you see the male stickleback. Here you have the one that looks like a male, but no red underbelly, no charging. Okay. Doesn't look like a fish, but now you're going to have a red underbelly. Male charges it right away. It's an automatic response. It's innate. Anytime that stimulus occurs, that male is going to attack that figure. You see another one, also doesn't look like a fish, but it has a red underbelly. Male automatically attacks it, no matter what. So here you see a good example of a fixed action pattern. This is not a learned behavior. Nothing taught this fish to do this. The first time it encountered a red structure, it automatically charged it. We're going to see another video using geese. When the egg rolls out of a goose's nest, they're pre-programmed to pull it back in. Doesn't matter how many times you do this to the goose, you keep doing it, it'll keep pulling it back in. It can't help it, it's pre-programmed. So it doesn't matter how many times you push the egg out of the nest, the goose will automatically pull it back in. It can't help itself. It's an innate behavior. It's pre-programmed. They do it every time they encounter the stimulus. Here you see the Konrad Lorenz video showing imprinting. I'm going to fast forward. Here you see Konrad Lorenz with his geese or his ducks, and they all think that he's their mother because he was with them during their critical period where they learned who their mother was. So here you see the geese following Konrad. So this idea of who their mother was imprinted in their brains. Really interesting. All right, now we have orientation behaviors. And orientation behaviors are behaviors that place an animal in its most favorable environment. And really, in terms of AP biology, these behaviors are the most important for us to know because we'll be doing a lab on them. The first one is called taxis. Taxis is movement directly towards or away from a stimulus. The stimulus could be light, could be heat, moisture, sound, chemicals. Right? Phototaxis would be movement towards or away from the light. For example, plants grow towards the light. You could have thermotaxis, movement towards or away from heat. For instance, if you look at most insects that live in cool, moist environments, they tend to move directly away from heat sources. You have chemotaxis, movement directly towards or away from very specific chemicals within the environment. Next, you have kinesis. Kinesis are random movements in response to a stimulus. Happens a lot if the organism's never encountered that stimulus before. They kind of move in all different directions. If they tend to move really fast, it usually indicates dislike. And if their movements tend to be slow, it usually indicates like, that they like that stimulus. Usually with kinesis, we see this a lot with insects that are not really easy to study their behaviors. Long distance seasonal orientation behaviors are called migrations. And migrations usually take place because of the availability of food or because the environment has broken down. A number of organisms go through long distance migrations: whales, birds, elks, insects, bats. And they do this to obtain food during seasons like the winter and because their environment breaks down during times like the winter. Agonistic behaviors. Agonistic behaviors are when animals respond to each other by either aggressive or submissive behaviors. A lot of agonistic behaviors intend to make the organism look bigger. For example, with a dog, when a dog performs its agonistic behavior, its hair stands up on the back of its neck, and it's intended to make it look bigger. Agonistic behaviors are used for animals to compete with each other. Typically, males perform agonistic behaviors towards each other, and it's a way to compete for things like food, mates, and territory. Agonistic behaviors are actually really important because they're ritualized and they're intended to reduce energy. It's a way to figure out who is top dog without actually fighting. We'll see a video now of an agonistic behavior. This is using the sun bear, and you can see it's pretty easy to see. Obviously, one is more aggressive and the other one is more submissive. And you can see it's opening its mouth, it's showing its teeth. It's not actually going to hurt the other bear, but it's just intended to show who the dominant male is in this situation. Altruistic behaviors. Altruistic behaviors are unselfish behaviors, and they appear to reduce that organism's fitness. They're behaviors that actually put an organism in harm's way, and they do that to help other organisms. Classic example here using the prairie dog. Right, there's usually one guard prairie dog that guards the nest, which is underground. They're kind of the lookout. And if they see a predator coming, they send out an alarm call. Well, that alarm call draws attention to itself, so it's pretty likely to get consumed or eaten by the predator, but it does it to help everybody else. Altruism. Finally, our last behavior is going to be foraging behaviors. Foraging behaviors are behaviors that are used to search for, recognize, or to capture food. Here we see a good foraging behavior being performed by a chimp. A chimp uses tools. In this case, it uses a twig to get termites out of a termite mound. Here's another video showing foraging behavior. And this is a black bear performing its foraging behavior. And it's getting, I think it's ants or some type of insect out of this tree. Alright, that concludes this video. Thank you.